These glasses are going to be a problem with the ring light, aren't they? Oh well, deal with it. I need to see. So, Team Star Kid's newest musical and the 5th installment of the Hatchetfield series premieres on YouTube on October 13th. And maybe you're going, oh god, it's been so long since I've taken a trip to the tiny town of Hatchetfield. I don't remember stuff. Or maybe you're going, I don't have time to watch 18 and a half hours of content, to which I reply, that's quitter talk. I'm kidding. Kind of. Anyway, I thought I'd make a cute little, or to be honest, probably not so little. How long is this video editing, Abby? Yeah, I mean, my script's like 2,000 words and I've not even finished writing it yet, so we're doing great. Anyway, I thought I'd make a little video that basically recaps the entire Hatchetfield universe, all the lore, all the stories, all the characters, everything that you kind of need to know before watching Nerdy Prudes Must Die, which you should watch because it's great and it's probably my favourite. I didn't say that. I'm sorry, Black Friday. Shh. We don't need to. They're all my favourites. Even Hey Melissa. Even Hey Melissa. I promise. You might be wondering, who the hell are you? Why are you so qualified to talk on this topic? So, I suppose I should probably introduce myself. Hi, I'm Abby, and I'm a self-proclaimed, but also I guess Star Kid approved Hatchetfield expert. I'm going to play that one clip of Mariah here to kind of prove my point.
I think Taylor and I were talking about you because I brought up the Star Kid Wiki. Anyway, we're talking about the Star Kid Wiki because we were talking about specifically Star Wars. It also comes back to Star Wars. And how they had, for Kenobi, they had a lore advisor. And I was like, no, I get that. There are people in the Star Kid fandom who know the lore more than every single one of the Star Kid cast members, myself included. And I brought you up, obviously.
See? I'm also the admin of the Star Kid Wiki, where I have 18,500 edits because I have no life. So all in all, I know a little bit about Hatchetfield. And by little, I mean it has consumed my every waking thought since 2019. So basically, I know what I'm talking about. So, I should probably start the recap now, shouldn't I? Let's go! So our story starts all the way back in the year 1824 on this teeny tiny island on Lake Michigan, where a woman named Willabella Mukwab lives. You see, Willabella is living her best life. She's got these supernatural abilities that's called having a touch of the gift. And these abilities allow her to do all sorts of things, but most prominently it enables her to see into an alternate dimension called the Black and White. I'll get into that later, I don't have time right now. And in this dimension lives a dark god known as Wigog-Urath. It's him. Willabella begins to worship him and becomes his first ever disciple. Strange choice, but I'm not gonna shame a woman. I love women. Because I'm a lesbian. Willabella does all sorts as part of her work as a disciple of Wigog-Urath, but the most prominent thing that she does is write a book. We love a woman who writes. This Barbie is an author. And this book contains all sorts of things like spells and incantations and burial rites. And it also allows the people who possess this to have supernatural abilities too. This book essentially allows the people that possess it to channel the power of those that live inside the Black and White, such as Wigog-Urath. So it's kind of a slay book, to be honest. Like, I kind of want to read it. I know, like, I probably shouldn't. I mean, the whole point is you shouldn't have the Black Book because the Black Book is bad. But, like, it's got lore in it. And that's, like, my whole thing. I probably shouldn't want to read the Black Book. Bell wrote this book, and she kind of slayed. But she didn't use ink to write it. She used the blood of children. So as you can kind of imagine, the parents of these children weren't really happy about this. So all of these people kind of banded together and arrested Willabella and executed her for crimes of witchcraft, which, I mean, they just hate to see a woman win. I'm kidding. She murdered children. I shouldn't be supporting a woman who kills children. Willabella was hung for her crimes of witchcraft, but the people of the village were like, death is not good enough for her. Clap if you think she should suffer. So they began to plant a wood around the site of Willabella's execution, and the roots of these trees formed a web that kind of trapped Willabella's soul eternally. No rest for the wicked child murderers who kind of slay. When I say they planted these trees, I kind of only half mean that. You see, the people of these village were like, this woman has bad vibes, so clearly everyone who has the same ability as her must also have bad vibes. So anyone that they found that had a touch of the gift, they would plant them in the ground and turn them into trees, which, I mean, kind of sounds magical. I don't know, kind of hypocritical of them. Like, I mean, why are you turning people into trees if you're trying to stop witchcraft? It's not also witchcraft. It's not relevant. I am a Hatchetman hater. And in turning them into trees, this caused the magic that these people supposedly had to be trapped in the wood of the trees so it couldn't escape and give someone else powers. And eventually, over time, these trees formed a large forest that covers a massive portion of the Hatchetfield Island, and it becomes known as Witchwood Forest. Excuse me, there was no need for this. That's so rude. High school is killing me. Yeah, so are you, bad. Shout out to, Sam from the Hatchetfield High School band who gave me this. And these people, who become known as the Hatchetmen, are still planting people even up to the modern day. And the Hatchetmen in 1824, after executing Willabella, were like, you know what we should do? Make a town here. And so they created a little town called Hatchetfield. Now, the spellbook that Willabella wrote wasn't destroyed. And eventually it came into the possession of a man named Mr. Young sometime before the year 1920. And it was in the year 1920 that Mr. Young married a woman named Sheila. MILF. No. And he showed her the power of the Black Book and how the book, a spell in the book, enabled him to stay forever young through a ritual in which these people would steal the life force and like the remaining years of life of the people, which would kill them, but it would allow Sheila and Mr. Young to stay eternally youthful. And then later on, in around 1945, Mr. Young became one of the first members of a brand new church known as the Church of the Starry Children. The church very quickly became very prominent in Hatchetfield as they founded a festival known as the Hatchetfield Honey Festival, which was a street fair with like stalls and live music and fireworks, and most prominently, a beauty pageant, where every year a woman would be crowned the Hatchetfield Honey Queen, the sweetest woman in Hatchetfield. And then every year, following the pageant, the members of the church would take the Honey Queen into the Witchwood, where they'd conduct this ritual where another god from the Black and White, known as Nibble and Ephim, or Nibley for short, would inhabit this body made up of dead pig carcasses that the church had offered as a sacrifice. And this happened because the night of the Honey Festival is the one night a year where this god Nibley is able to walk upon the earth. However, Nibley is a creature that's almost entirely defined by hunger. So when he would arrive on Earth, he'd be hungry as all hell. So the church would offer the Honey Queen up as a sacrifice, and Nibley would eat her. And then in return for this offering, the members of the Church of the Starry Children were all granted all sorts of wealth and power, which made them some of the most powerful people in Hatchetfield. And the church would continue to operate and worship these dark gods for many years, until about 1979, when the church was attacked by the Hatchetmen. You know, the tree dudes from before. Because they weren't happy about them practicing witchcraft. Because they were like, yo, dudes, this god's bestie killed our children way back in the day. And they basically massacred the whole church, killing a large portion of the membership, including Mr. Young. However, the church did not end there. it survived, and they continued to plan the honey festival and stuff and keep making sacrifices right up until the modern day. Now we're going to take a brief interlude from the cults and the murders and the death, lots of death, to take a brief interlude in 2003, where a teenage boy named Paul Matthews went on a field trip from his high school, Sycamore High, to the other local high school, Hatchetfield High, and he watched their production of Brigadoon. And he hates it, like, so much. And from that day on, he decides he doesn't like musicals, and that becomes a key part of his personality. Then, the year after this, on October 17th, 2004, a young boy who's about college age, who goes by the name of Ted Spankowski, is getting ready to confess his love to his best friend, Jenny. And he's nervous, so he decides he's going to have a bit of a drink, you know, a bit of liquid courage before he decides to go visit her. But he seemingly gets a bit too drunk and passes out. And then the next morning, Ted wakes up and finds a letter from Jenny, which explains that she was in love with him too, but that being near him was too painful. And so she opted to move to Hatchetfield's sister city of Clydesdale with a man named Andy, and Ted never sees her again. And Ted is absolutely devastated by this, so he decides that he needs to change himself. So he becomes, by his own admission, a pushy asshole and a general all-around sleazeball. Yay! Now we move on to 2005, which is a super important year in the Hatchetfield series. A lot of important things happen in this year, but for now, I think it's important to take a break and quickly discuss the Hatchetfield timeline. Up until this point, the timeline of events that I've talked about all take place chronologically in a single timeline. But 2005 is when things start getting super fucky with Hatchetfield. You see, something happens in 2005 which causes the timeline to rupture and split into loads of smaller threads. It kind of looks like a head massager. I made the diagram. I can say that, I promise. Everything that happened prior to 2005 still happened in all of these smaller timelines, but now every timeline has its own distinct chronology and event. However, some things are still consistent across timelines. Now, what caused the timeline to split in this way isn't exactly known. However, many events happen alongside it in 2005, which causes it to be a very tumultuous year in the town of Hatchetfield. One example of this is how in 2005, a division of the United States military named Paranormal Extraterrestrial Interdimensional Phenomena, or PEEP for short, P-E-I-P, completed their work on a portal to another realm. This realm they create a portal to is called the Black and White. Remember that from before? This realm exists outside of all dimensions and timelines in Hatchetfield, and it's simply just a swirling sea of psychic energy. And within this dimension, there resides a number of eldritch creatures. The most prominent of these creatures is Wigog Urath, or Wiggly, who is the ruler of the Black and White, and the person that Willabella Muckorb acted as his disciple of all the way back in 1824. And Wiggly also has 4 brothers known as Pocotho, or Pokey for short, Blicklotep, or Blinky for short, Tanoikaraxis, or Tinky, and Nibble and Ephim, or Nibbly, you know, the hungry sacrifice guy. And together they all form a group known as the Lords in Black. Now, each of the Lords in Black has their own distinct set of powers, and these powers can be used by people who are in possession of the spells within the Black Book. As well as the Lords in Black, the Black and White is also home to another creature, a Queen in White, named Webby, who is the Lords in Black's sister. As well as this, the Lords in Black also have a legion of lesser creatures who are called the Sniggles. And the Sniggles they're not very powerful, and pretty much their only purpose in life is to serve the Lords in Black. So in 2005, Peep created this portal to the Black and White, and one of the members of the organisation, a colonel named Wilbercross, stepped through the portal. While in there, he supposedly loses his mind and pledges his allegiance to the Lords in Black. He then exits the portal and disappears. Meanwhile, somewhere in the world, a mysterious woman decides to change her name to Miss Holloway to prevent people from realising that she's immortal. There will be more on this later, I promise. That sounds really out of context. Miss Holloway then ends up in a battle with Wilbur Cross, and the two are very evenly matched. And as they are fighting, the timeline splits, which ultimately results in each of them only winning the battle in about half the timelines. And in the timeline where one of them wins, they kill the other. As well as this, on October 5th, 2005, in the town of Hatchetfield, Willabella Muckwab's great-great-granddaughter, Pamela Foster, gives birth to a little girl named Hannah Foster. This baby is born with extraordinary psychic abilities. And we'll come back to her later. Now, while the timeline is split into lots of different timelines, one significant event seemingly happens across all the timelines. A canon event, if you will. So we're going to discuss that now. On December 24th, 2017, a man named Tom Houston, his son Tim, and his wife, Jane Perkins, are driving home from Tom's parents' house when they pull out into an intersection and they're struck by another car. The crash is really bad and it causes Jane to die. And her death has a major impact on everyone that knew her, but especially her sister Emma. You see, Emma left Hatchetfield many years prior and has spent much of her time backpacking in Guatemala. And Jane's death changes Emma and makes her reassess her life. So Emma decides to return to Hatchetfield and enroll in community college. And she also gets a job while she's there in a local coffee shop named Beanie's. And that was all backstory. Yay. So now we're up to the first story in the Hatchetfield series. The guy who didn't like musicals. The Guy Who Didn't Like Musicals takes place in October 2018 and follows a man named Paul Matthews, an average guy with a distaste for musicals. Paul works at a company known as Coven Communication, Research and Power, or CCRP for short, in their technical department with a few of his colleagues. There's a woman named Charlotte who is desperately trying and failing to save her marriage with her husband Sam, who cheats on her regularly with many women, including a barista named Zoe. There's also Bill Woodward, a man who wants nothing but to get his daughter Alice back after his recent divorce with his wife, which caused him to only be able to see his daughter for 1 week a month. And his daughter spends much of that time with her father, with her girlfriend, Deb. There is also Ted, the same guy from before, who's the office sleazeball who's actively having an affair with Charlotte. Paul also regularly frequents a local coffee shop called Beanie's, as he has a crush on the barista there, a woman named Emma. Paul's life is going great, or as good as it can be when you're working a corporate office job. Until one day, a meteor crashes into the Starlight Theatre in downtown Hatchetfield. This meteor contains a pathogen that begins infecting the people of Hatchetfield, which causes them to become part of a hive mind of singing and dancing zombies. And slowly, the world of Hatchetfield slowly starts becoming a musical. Paul awakens and goes about his day, and is confronted by a group of the zombies on his way to work. And naturally, Paul is immediately horrified by this, and rushes into the office just thinking it's a one-off event thing that's just kind of a bit horrific and a hazard to society. However, upon his arrival, he's called into his boss's office, and his boss then begins singing at Paul, asking him what does he want and what does he want to do with his life. This terrifies Paul, who then flees the building and goes to Beanie's coffee shop, where he tries to warn Emma of the musical apocalypse spreading through town, and she's very skeptical of this until all of the customers in the coffee shop suddenly start coughing and choking for no apparent reason. And it's revealed that Emma's co-workers, the barista Zoe and Nora, have infected the coffee with some sort of blue goo, which has caused all the people who drank the coffee to become infected and part of the hive mind. Emma and Paul escape from the coffee shop and flee to this alley where they bump into Ted, Bill and Charlotte, who are somehow still human. And Charlotte tells the group that she's called her husband to come and help them. But when it's arrived, it's revealed that Sam and the rest of his police squad are infected. And these police officers then begin attacking the group. But they're stopped when Ted hits Sam over the head with a trash can lid. And this causes a major head injury for Sam and causes his brain to fall out. And Charlotte's very distressed by this. I mean, you would be if you saw your husband's brain fall out. It's not exactly the most pleasant thing in the world. And because Charlotte insists that they need to get help for Sam, the group decide to go and visit Emma's biology professor, a man by the name of Henry Higgins, who is a doomsday survivalist, so has all sorts of defences around his house to try and keep things like, musical zombies out. When the group arrive at Higgins' house, he orders them to cuff Sam to a chair, and while inspecting Sam's wounds, Higgins finds more of this blue goo oozing out of the injury. After this, Higgins suggests that the infection was caused by an alien pathogen sent down by the meteor that infects people and makes it a part of the hive mind. Now, Higgins was almost right about this. And I mean, it was a pathogen and it was infecting people, but it wasn't being caused by aliens. You see, the meteor was sent by an eldritch god by the name of Picotho, or Pokey. The one from the black and white. And he despises any voice that's not his own. So he starts infecting the whole town to make them all under his control. Upon discovering this blue goo, Higgins goes to analyse it in the lab, and the rest of the group go to enjoy Higgins' home bar, and ultimately leave Charlotte alone with her husband. Sam then wakes up from his unconscious state and begins to sing at Charlotte, begging her to untie him or else he's going to die. And she eventually does, which enables Sam to kill her. And so Charlotte becomes part of the infected group. Meanwhile, in Higgins' home bar, Paul and Emma are bonding with one another and discuss all sorts. Emma talks about her sister and how Jane is the reason she came back to Hatchetfield. And Paul informs Emma that the production of Brigadoon she was in 2003 it's what caused him to hate musicals forever. And as they're having this conversation, they're interrupted by Charlotte and Sam, who come rushing into the room and begin attacking them all. However, they're then shot by Professor Higgins before they're able to do any real damage. However, it's just after this that Bill gets a phone call from his daughter Alice, who reveals that she didn't get on the bus to go home to her mother that morning, but instead got off to go see her girlfriend, Deb, and is now trapped in Hatchetfield. Bill decides that he's going to go get his daughter so he can save her, and Paul agrees to go with him to show him a shortcut to the school where Alice is hiding, and the two go off in search of her. They eventually arrive at Hatchetfield High and find that Alice has already been infected. This devastates Bill, who then takes the gun that Higgins gave them to protect themselves with and tries to turn it on himself. Now, Paul is not having this as Bill is his best friend, so he wrestles the gun out of the man's hand and drops it on the ground right in front of the infected Alice, who then picks up the gun and shoots her father. The remaining zombies then attempt to attack Paul, but are scared away by the military suddenly appearing in the school and shooting at the zombies. Paul tries to reason with the military, but they refuse to believe that he's not infected, so they knock him out. Later, Paul comes to and finds himself in an interrogation room with a man named General McNamara of the Special Unit Military, PEIP, or PEEP. McNamara offers Paul a way to get off the island, and Paul agrees to take it, but asks if he can bring Emma with him as well. McNamara agrees and gives Paul his gun, and Paul goes back off to try and save Emma. Meanwhile, in Higgins' lab, Emma suggests that the meteor could be acting as a central brain for the hive mind, and that destroying it could destroy all the zombies and cause them all to drop dead. However, Higgins has another opinion on the hive mind and believes that it could be the cause of world peace if everyone is part of one central brain. So he knocks Emma out with a tranquilizer. Emma then wakes up and finds herself tied to a chair alongside Ted. Higgins then appears and reveals to the group that he intends to take down all of the defences surrounding his house so that the zombies can get in, which horrifies Emma and Ted, naturally. Higgins then begins performing a song for Ted and Emma, which is a song from the musical he's been writing while in isolation, Working Boys. This music then draws the zombies to him and causes them to attack and kill Higgins. But before they can attack Emma and Ted, Paul appears and unties them, and they manage to escape the building. However, as they're escaping, Paul is grabbed by another one of the zombies, and while Emma goes to try and save him, Ted runs off by himself. He then eventually gets to the park where the helicopter was supposed to meet them, and when he gets there, Ted finds that the entire military unit have been infected and are now part of the hive mind. And General McNamara shoots and kills Ted, which, to be honest, he kind of deserved. Maybe you wouldn't have had this problem if you didn't leave Paul and Emma behind. Anyway, Paul and Emma manage to get away from the zombies and arrive and find Ted and the rest of the military unit infected. But they manage to get on the helicopter. However, upon getting on the helicopter, Paul and Emma discover that it's being piloted by Emma's co-worker, Zoe, who is another part of the hive mind. And as they try and fight to stop Zoe infecting them, they crash the helicopter, which badly injures Emma, impaling her leg, so she can't walk on it. Emma then tells Ted about her idea that destroying the meteor could cause the entire hive mind to stop and drop dead. So Paul goes off to try and destroy the meteor. Paul eventually arrives at the Starlight Theatre and is greeted by Bill and Ted and an excellent adventure. No, I'm kidding. He's greeted by his boss and a few of the other infected zombies. And the zombies don't try and stop Paul from destroying the meteor, as the air surrounding the meteor in the theatre is full of infectious spores, and as Paul breathes it in, he slowly becomes more and more infected. And as he goes towards the meteor, Paul begins singing and dancing. However, before he becomes fully infected, Paul manages to destroy the meteor. A few weeks later, Emma wakes up in a hospital in Clivesdale, where she's been recovering from her leg injury. And she's told by another member of the military unit, Peep, Colonel Schaefer, that she's been given a new name and a new identity, and has been granted a plot of land in Colorado where she can fulfill her dream of owning a pot farm, which is what she went to school to learn how to do. Emma is then told that she'll be escorted to Colorado by a man named Ben Bridges, who is later revealed to be Paul. Emma is overjoyed to see Paul again and rushes into his arms, until he starts singing. And it's revealed that destroying the meteor didn't stop the hive mind, as Pocotho still exists in the black and white. And that now that Paul is on the mainland, rather than the Hatchetfield Island, the hive mind infection is going to spread throughout the entire world. And Paul then attacks and infects Emma. And within 2 weeks, the entire world is infected. And that's the end of The Guy Who Didn't Like Musicals. We're on to a new show, so we're changing the light colour. Does that change anything? Is this all going to be obvious on camera? No, not really. The light's green now, so that's fun. Maybe I should move it closer. No, I should not. Now we move on to the 23rd of November 2018, in an entirely different timeline to The Guy Who Didn't Like Musicals. It's time for Black Friday. I've brought an important prop. It's my boy. Black Friday follows the town of Hatchetfield, as the entire town gets excited about a brand new doll that's being released on that day. Now, one person who wants this doll is a man named Tom Houston, who desperately wants to get this doll for his son, Tim, as Tom blames himself for his wife's death and the effect it's had on his son, and he believes that getting this doll for his son for Christmas will make everything better. So Tom heads to Lakeside Mall, and while there, he bumps into one of his former students, as Tom used to be a shop teacher at Hatchetfield High, and this student's name is Lex Foster. Lex works at the toy store, Toy Zone, where Tom is going to get the doll. And you see, Lex also wants one of these dolls because Lex dreams of moving with her sister and her boyfriend to California, as Lex's mum is abusive and an alcoholic, and Lex just really wants a better life for her sister. So Lex decides to steal a doll in order to sell it for herself. Lex puts the doll in a backpack and gives it to her little sister Hannah. Hannah immediately refuses to take this backpack, as she says her friend Webby told her not to. Lex tries to reason with Hannah, but Hannah is having none of it, until her boyfriend Ethan offers Hannah a magic hat. And according to Ethan, this hat was given to him by a great warrior, and as long as the hat is on her head, nothing can harm her. Should I keep this on for the whole Black Friday section? Yes, I will. It's thematic. Upon having the hat, Hannah agrees to take the backpack. We then go to the line outside of Toy Zone in Lakeside Mall, where a woman named Linda Monroe pushes in the line by buying her way in, as she wants 4 dolls for her 4 sons. And this greatly annoys another woman in the line who's been waiting all night by the name of Becky Barnes. Becky argues with Linda and is like, what the hell are you doing? This is not slay behaviour. And Linda argues with Becky and basically belittles her by bringing up the fact that Becky was abused by her husband, and that kind of shuts Becky up. And then in the line, Tom, who's just arrived, like an hour before doors open, so it's Black Friday, what are you doing? And bumps into Becky. And it's revealed that Tom and Becky used to date each other in high school. And immediately the entire line is like, oh my god, it's Tom and Becky. Oh my god, they still love each other. His wife's dead. Her husband's left her for some other woman. They might get together now. I mean, they're both past their prime, but eventually the customers enter the store. And initially, everything seems to be going well. A man named Sherman Young, the son of a Mrs. Sheila and Mr. Young, attempts to buy all the dolls, which he almost does, until Linda complained because she's a Karen. Honest, I'm not kidding, that's genuinely her personality trait. And slowly, the atmosphere in Toy Zone shifts until eventually it descends into chaos as all of the customers begin rioting, attempting to get their hands on a Wiggly doll, which honestly, skill issue, like, I've got one. Actually, I have 2 because I'm built different. Sorry. We're not going to talk about how much money I spent on Hatchetfield merch, guys. Like, we're not going to talk about this. Or the fact I'm wearing a Nerdy Prudes t-shirt. Or a hat. Let's not bring that up. Meanwhile, while Lex is working, her boyfriend Ethan and her sister Hannah decide they're going to go to the Cineplex in the mall and see a movie. This doesn't end up working out, and eventually the riots that have broken out in Toy Zone spread throughout the whole mall, including the Cineplex. Ethan is attacked by 2 of the shoppers, who kick him to death while Hannah is able to escape. As Ethan is dying, he's then stumbled upon by Tom and Becky, who, I mean, Becky holds him while Ethan dies. However, Becky has a doll, and immediately after this, they are attacked by another shopper, who grabs the doll from Becky after stabbing Tom. And so Becky rushes Tom to the Cineplex, where she finds a sewing kit, and as she's a nurse, stitches Tom back together so he doesn't die. Meanwhile, in some other location in the mall, the creator of the Wiggly doll, a man named Wilbur Cross, approaches Linda Monroe and offers her everything she's ever dreamed of if she becomes a prophet for the god Wiggly. And Linda agrees, as she wants nothing more than to be powerful. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., the cabinet is panicking because riots have broken out for Wiggly dolls all across the country, and they have no idea what's causing it until the vice president brings a fluffy doll into the cabinet, which eventually causes the cabinet itself to break down into chaos, and they begin attacking each other. Until a mysterious man walks in and shoots the doll, destroying its power. That man is General John McNamara from Guy Who Didn't Like Musicals. McNamara requests that the president, Howard Goodman, comes with him as he knows how they might be able to stop the dolls and the riots. McNamara takes President Goodman all the way to Peep HQ and shows him the portal they created to the black and white all the way back in 2005. And then he explains that the dolls are actually smaller versions of the god Wiggly. Kind of like a God and Jesus situation. You know, like the father's the son, the son's the father. McNamara explains how he's going to send Howard through the portal into the black and white to attempt to reason with Wiggly. So Goodman goes through the portal and he tries to reason with Wiggly. It goes about as well as you can imagine reasoning with an eldritch god whose only real want in the world is to take over the world. And he's then attacked by Wiggly's Sniggles. Remember them? My faves. I love the Sniggles. And McNamara is forced to enter the portal to save him, but McNamara enters without any protective gear. And while McNamara is able to save Goodman and let him escape out of the portal, McNamara's body begins to dissolve within the black and white. And so his soul is absorbed into it. Upon escaping from the black and white, Howard orders a nuke to be sent through the portal in order to blow up Wiggly in the hopes that this will stop him. However, what Howard doesn't know is that Wilbur Cross, everyone's fave slimy dude, I love him so much. Wilbur Cross went to Russia and told the Russians that the Americans had this portal. So the Russians built their own, which means Wiggly is able to take the nuke that the Americans sent through the portal in the hopes of killing him and push it through the Russians' portal, resulting in Moscow being nuked, which devastates the president. And he's immediately rushed to Air Force One to prepare for a counterstrike. And that's the last we see of him. Meanwhile in Hatchetfield, my favourite phrase, Frank and Lex have been captured by the shoppers of the mall, who have now formed a Wiggly worshipping cult, led by Linda Monroe, because who else to lead a cult than a MILF? And Linda is desperately seeking a Wiggly doll, and she asks Frank where there is one, and he doesn't know. So she kills him. While this is happening, Tom regains consciousness in the Cineplex, and Becky explains to him how he was stabbed and how she saved him, and the two begin to reminisce about their times together in high school. Eventually, Tom and Becky get onto the conversation of Jane and her death, and Tom explains how he feels guilty for Jane's death and almost like he killed his own family. And Becky responds by telling Tom about how her husband did abuse her, and how eventually she killed him. Eventually, Tom and Becky realise that, yeah, their lives have been kind of shitty, but hey, they've still got each other. And the two have sex in a cinema while a shitty Christmas movie plays. This happens multiple times. The shitty Christmas movie, not the cinema part. That's only this time. Meanwhile, Hannah, everyone's favourite psychic teenager, is hiding from everyone. And as she's there, Hannah is haunted by the ghost of Ethan. Except it's not Ethan. It's an evil, corrupted version of him. It's Wiggly. And he basically tells Hannah that she needs to give the doll to Linda. Hannah is horrified by this because she realises it's not Ethan. And she refuses. And then Hannah realises that it's the doll talking to her. And by the doll, I mean the god. And Hannah pulls the doll out of her backpack and speaks to Wiggly. And she's like, no, I'm not going to listen to you because Webby said you're bad. And Wiggly's incredibly annoyed by this. And he's like, yeah, well, Webby's a stupid bitch. Siblings! And Hannah eventually throws the doll away from her in terror. And as she does this, Tom and Becky appear. And they see that Hannah has a doll. And generally, Tom and Becky are nice people. However, like every single other adult in the mall, they are under the spell of the Wiggly doll. And all they want is to get their hands on this doll at this point. So the two corner and trap Hannah, and Tom grabs her while Becky attempts to tranquilize her. However, Hannah has her magic hat on, so while it's on her head, nothing can harm her. So Becky accidentally stabs the syringe into her leg, which causes Becky to be knocked out. And so Tom takes the doll and walks off, leaving Becky and Hannah there. And Hannah is trapped by Becky's body weight on top of her. And just as Tom leaves, two members of Linda's cult appear and find Hannah and Becky, and they take them to Linda. Meanwhile, somewhere else in the mall, Lex has been taken by Sherman Young to be killed, and she tries to reason with Sherman and it doesn't work. And so Sherman is about to kill her by choking her when General McNamara appears to Lex. As you see, much like Hannah, Lex has psychic abilities and she's able to see into the black and white where McNamara is. And McNamara offers Lex his gun, which she manages to pull out of the black and white and uses it to shoot Sherman, which kills him, and Lex is able to escape. McNamara then explains to Lex that in order to save the world, she has to stop Linda from getting the doll. And so he tells her to awaken the Warrior of Light. Lex then goes and finds Tom Houston as he's about to escape from the mall with the doll. And she talks him out of the spell of Wiggly, explaining how Wiggly supposedly helps fix all of the problems that all these adults have in their life, but it's just complete and utter bullshit. And eventually Tom comes to realise that what Lex is saying is true, and he breaks out of the spell and realises that this doll isn't going to help fix his relationship with his son. spending time with his son is going to help him fix his relationship with his son. Now he's out of the spell, Tom realizes that Becky and Hannah have been taken to Linda, who's going to kill them. So Tom and Lex devise a plan, while Tom sneaks around the back and captures Linda and holds a gun to her head. However, when Lex threatens to destroy the doll, Linda, with some superhuman strength, manages to break out of Tom's grip and gets the doll for herself. Linda and the cult then begin to celebrate the fact that they've got a doll, and they don't notice one Becky Barnes awakening from her drug-induced sleep, and Becky grabs the gun that Tom had. She points it at Linda and shoots her in the head, killing her. Lex then takes the one remaining Wiggly doll and sets fire to it, leaving the cult, who, if they won't abandon their god, burn to death. And the whole mall then begins to burn down. Lex and Hannah and Becky and Tom all manage to escape the mall, and they gather with other citizens of Hatchetfield to count down to the end of Black Friday. And then suddenly there's a whooshing noise overhead, and the stage goes dark. The ending is ambiguous, but it's also sort of implied that the town was nuked as part of the war with Russia. And that's the end of Black Friday. Now we move on to Nightmare Time.
You can't run if I don't catch you, but the Nightmare Time already caught you.
I love Nightmare Time. Nightmare Time, for those of you who don't know, is Star Kids' Zoom series that they did over the COVID pandemic. It's basically a lot of live readings of Hatchetfield stories done by the entire cast of Guardian Light Musicals on Black Friday. And it's really cool. And if you haven't watched them, you genuinely should give them a watch, because I know they're kind of difficult to watch because of the format they're in. But the stories are some of the Lang brothers' best writing of all time. So, like, genuinely, if you haven't watched them yet, you should. And if you don't want to, I'm not going to judge you. I'm going to break down everything that happens in those stories and all the important lore you need to know now. The first story is a story called The Hatchetfield Ape-Man, and it follows an English duchess named Lucy Stockworth, who has spent all of her life searching for this mysterious creature that supposedly lives in the Hatchetfield Witchwood, the Hatchetfield Ape-Man. However, Lucy is coming towards the end of her search and she's eventually giving up. You see, the reason that Lucy wants to find this Ape-Man is because when she was a young girl, she climbed up a tree in Hatchetfield on a family holiday. Vacation? A family vacation. When she fell from the tree, she was caught by this furry creature, the Ape-Man, and she wants to find him again so she can thank him. And Lucy is eventually about to give up her search as she's about to be married to her fiancé, and she might not have time for it after she gets married. And she's about to return home to England when she's approached by a Mr. Henry Higgins. And Higgins tells Lucy that he has found the Ape-Man. So Lucy goes with Higgins to his manor in the middle of the Witchwood, and in his greenhouse, Higgins presents Lucy with what he calls the Ape-Man. And he explains to Lucy that this man may look like a naked man, but it is really the Ape-Man. He explains the reason that he looks like a naked man is because he had to shave him to treat his wounds and this rash he had. And Lucy believes him because she's dumb. Lucy is a very interesting character. I don't understand why she's like this. And Lucy goes into the greenhouse and sees this Ape-Man, who reveals his name to be Conk, and agrees to stay with Higgins for some time to help study him. Over time, Lucy begins to bond with the Ape-Man and the two become friends. However, it's later revealed that this man is not an Ape-Man. It is just a naked man. And it's actually Ted from The Guy Who Didn't Like Musicals. And the reason Ted and Higgins are doing this is because they're trying to scam Lucy out of her money. Because Lucy has a huge fortune, and Higgins wants to use this to fund his musical. Lucy spent for ages in Hatchetfield, and eventually her fiancé from England arrives to see what's taking her so long, because, you know, she was supposed to get married. And Lucy shows him the Ape-Man, and this man is immediately just not impressed. He's like, excuse me, this is just a naked man. And Lucy's like, how dare you? Lucy has a fight with her fiancé, breaks off the marriage, and storms out of the room. Higgins then decides to take Lucy's fiancé hunting, and while they're out, Higgins shoots Jonathan, Lucy's fiancé, and kills him. Higgins then returns to his manor and tells Lucy that Jonathan has gone back to England and that the wedding is off, which Lucy is, like, horrified by, as she immediately regrets breaking up with Jonathan. Higgins then reveals to Ted that he killed Jonathan and Ted is horrified by this. Ted then decides to pull out of the plan and informs Higgins that he actually kind of likes Lucy and does actually want to get married to her genuinely, and that when he does, he will not share the fortune with Higgins, which Higgins is horrified by because this man cares for nothing except his music. Anyway, that night, Ted proposes to Lucy as Conk, the Ape-Man, but Higgins bursts in and pretends to be another Ape-Man? It was an interesting move from Henry Higgins there. And then he reveals to Lucy that Ted is not in fact the Ape-Man and is just a naked man. Lucy is horrified by this and Higgins pressures her, saying she has to marry one of them or he'll kill her. Lucy then tries to run away, but Higgins points his gun at her and shoots. However, Ted jumps in front of the bullet and takes the bullet for her. Lucy then grabs Ted and pulls him from the room and locks Higgins in the greenhouse, but Ted dies in her arms. Higgins then is able to escape from the greenhouse by breaking through the windows and begins chasing Lucy through the witchwood. Lucy manages to give quite a chase until she gets caught in a bear trap and Higgins is able to catch up with her. Higgins then pulls out a check and asks for Lucy to sign away her fortune, to which Lucy reveals she spent her entire fortune searching for the Ape-Man, and Higgins is incredibly angry for this and is about to kill her. But Lucy hits him with a tree branch, which honestly kind of slay, and climbs up a tree. And Higgins then manages to recover himself and is about to shoot Lucy again, but he's picked up in the air by some mysterious figure. The real Hatchetfield Ape-Man. And this Ape-Man pulls off Higgins' arms and leaves him to die, and then catches Lucy just as she loses her grip in the tree. Lucy then thanks her saver, who reveals his name to be Chumby, the Hatchfield Ape-Man. And the two go off together into the mist. Now we move on to the second Nightmare Time story, Watch a World. Watch a World follows Bill and Alice Woodward as they take a daddy-daughter trip to the Hatchetfield theme park, Watch a World. The story opens with Alice and Bill driving towards the theme park, and Alice is scrolling on her phone, and she tells her dad about how her girlfriend Deb is hosting a party that night that she can't go to because she's spending time with her dad. Her dad's like, oh, well, it's fine, we're gonna have a good time together. And eventually, Bill and Alice arrive at Watch a World, and Alice is immediately irritated by her dad treating her like a child when she's 18. But Bill is just so excited to be spending time with his daughter, and so Bill immediately rushes off to go and get the two of them flash passes. And while Bill is doing this, Alice drops her gum wrapper on the floor and is immediately approached by this giant cyclopean costumed monster. It's the Watch a World theme park mascot, Blinky. The monster reprimands Alice for dropping her gum and makes her pick it up. But when she does, he's kind of creepy as he watches her short shorts rise as she bends down. And Alice immediately just tells him to fuck off because he's being creepy. Bill and Alice then spend some time going on some rides, and eventually they go to this musical extravaganza show called Blinky's Watch Party. This watch party features the Sniggles, and it especially follows one Sniggle by the name of Sniglet, who talks about how she dreams of escaping from Drowsy Town and going to live a different life. The other Sniggles are then immediately horrified by this, as their one purpose is to serve Blinky. And so they begin murdering all of these other creatures that Sniglet wanted to go live with, until the show goes wrong and the actress playing Sniglet is hit in the head with a mallet, which immediately causes her to begin bleeding. The director of the show runs out and is like, oh my god, are you okay? Blah, 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 blah. And then the curtain closed. And Alice is horrified by this because this woman just got injured. And no one seems to care. No one mentions it. She goes and asks one of the employees there whether the woman's okay, and they're like, what woman? So Alice is a bit freaked out by this, but she and her dad leave the theatre. Following the show, Bill and Alice go to eat some food. And while they're doing this, Alice checks her phone and realises that Ziggs is going to Deb's party. Ziggs is this person that Deb, Alice's girlfriend, used to have a crush on. And so Alice is scared that Deb is going to cheat on her at the party with Ziggs. And Bill is kind of dismissive to this. He's like, oh, well, maybe if there's problems, then you two just not meant to be together. And Alice is incredibly annoyed by this because this is her first big relationship. She loves Deb and she wants to be with her, but Alice is very insecure and is terrified of losing Deb. Following this, Bill and Alice decide to go on the main attraction at Watcherworld, the Tearjerker, which is the tallest roller coaster in the Midwest. And the two slowly go up the roller coaster. However, once they get to the top of the tallest hill, the roller coaster breaks down, trapping Bill and Alice there. While they're told to wait in their seats until someone can come and get them, Bill and Alice refuse, and the two of them get off the ride. However, Alice is scared of heights, so Bill gets Alice to talk about this play she wrote that got her into a playwriting course at university, and he gets her to talk it through as he slowly leads her back down to the ground. And while this happens, Alice is holding her phone in her hands, and Bill tells her to put it away, but Alice explains that because women's fashion sucks, her phone won't fit in her pocket, so Bill takes it, but accidentally drops it, and the phone falls all the way down to the ground from the top of the roller coaster. Eventually, once Bill and Alice get down to the floor, Alice asks for her phone back, and realises that Bill lost it. She is horrified by this because Instagram was her only way of checking on her girlfriend at the party. And so Bill and Alice eventually get into a fight, which ends with Bill telling Alice that he doesn't like her. Following this fight, Bill and Alice break off and go their separate ways. And while they're apart, Bill begins to spend money attempting to win a strongman game in order to win Alice a Blinky doll. And he keeps failing at the strongman game until eventually he starts picturing that Alice's head is the pad where he hits the thing. Much to Bill's horror, it works and he wins the doll for her. And the barker of this stall then suggests to Bill that Alice needs to be disciplined and hands her the mallet in order to discipline her. You see, this theme park isn't a normal theme park in the slightest. Everyone in it is kind of infected and is kind of under Blinky, the Lord in Black's spell, and acting as like players in this play that Blinky is putting on for his own entertainment. As Blinky is not entirely malevolent. He simply cares about doing things he will find entertaining and fun to watch. So the barker convinces Bill that he needs to discipline Alice and gives her this mallet so that he can fight her. Meanwhile, in some other point in Watcherworld, Alice is playing a shooting game when she's approached by a psychic by the name of Madame Iris. Madame Iris then gives Alice her phone back somehow. Alice scrolls through Instagram and sees these photos of Deb and Ziggs becoming closer, and it seems like Deb is cheating on Alice, or is about to cheat on Alice. And Madame Iris convinces Alice that the way to save her relationship is to go to Deb and go to the party, and the only way she can do this is if she gets her dad's car keys. So Madame Iris then hands Alice a real shotgun and convinces her to go and get her car keys from her dad. This results in Bill and Alice meeting each other on the main street of the theme park at the time of the parade. And the two begin fighting each other, all for Blinky's amusement. And as they're fighting, eventually, Alice loses her gun. And Bill is about to break Alice's legs with the mallet when he realises that she's having a panic attack, and he stops. And Bill manages to break out of the spell and drops the mallet in order to comfort his daughter. This annoys Blinky because this is not the story he wanted to watch. So suddenly this giant Blinky mascot appears out of the shadows and is about to attack Bill and Alice when Alice shoots him with her gun. And this causes this mass of purple sludge to start spewing out of Blinky, and it carries Bill and Alice all the way out to the car park, to the parking lot. I do American words. And the two of them manage to escape and drive away. And upon exiting Watcherworld, Alice and Bill are much closer, to the point of Alice requesting to follow her father on Instagram. Now we move on to the story Forever and Always. Forever and Always opens with Paul Matthews and Emma Perkins, from The Guy Who Didn't Like Musicals, getting married. Everyone is so happy at this wedding until the local Hatchetfield homeless man invades the wedding, claiming that Emma isn't actually Emma Perkins. And then this man is removed from the venue. But Emma is really shaken by this, and she runs away from the wedding. Paul then follows after her, and while they're out there, Emma reveals that she's not really Emma. She tells Paul that she was also backpacking in Guatemala with Emma when Emma died in a bus crash. And that was when Tom rang her to tell her that Jane had died. Emma then explains that she didn't have the heart to tell Tom that she wasn't Emma. And so Emma, she basically went to Jane's funeral in Emma's place, pretended to be Emma, and has continued doing that ever since. And Paul, while shocked by this, kind of accepts it, and the two get married and go on their honeymoon. Eventually, they go back to work, and that day, Paul goes to get coffee. While going to get coffee on his during his day at work, he bumps into who he believes is his wife on the main street of Hatchetfield. And he's extremely excited to see her because, you know, it's his wife and they've just got married. They've just got back off their honeymoon. And Paul, like, you know, is overtly affectionate with this woman because he believes it's his wife. And she is not happy about it. Emma is immediately horrified and kind of pushes him away and makes a big scene on the street calling Paul a pervert, which, I mean, fair, this random man just tried to kiss her. And Paul is upset by this, and so he carries on with his work day and goes home that night and confronts Emma about it. He's like, why did you do that to me today? And Emma is immediately suspicious. She's like, what do you mean? That wasn't me. So Emma goes and leaves and takes a knife with her and says she has to do something. Soon after Emma leaves, the other Emma appears at the apartment and begins asking Paul all sorts of questions, like why people think she's married, why people think she works at this coffee shop. Like, she doesn't understand. And then she goes into this apartment and sees hundreds of photos of herself with Paul and almost like this entire life that she's never led. And Paul is very confused by this because as far as he knows, this is his wife. They look identical. And so Emma decides to take him to the Birdhouse, a local bar. When they arrive there, Emma explains that this woman has stolen her life and she has no idea what any of this is. And Paul is still skeptical. He thinks it's Emma playing a prank on him or something that's going to lead to some sort of weird roleplay surprise. And then Paul decides to go to the bathroom. And while he's in the bathroom, the other Emma appears in the bar and holds Emma at knife point. She then explains that she cut the brake of real Emma's bus and stole her life intentionally. But so unknown to the Emma that's married to Paul, the real Emma survived. And now she's back in Hatchetfield. The Emma that's married to Paul then tries to get Emma to leave the bar with her so she can kill her. But as they're going, they bump into these bikers who begin flirting with the women. And the real Emma, the one who's not married to Paul, leans into this to try and get away from the person who wants to murder her. And this eventually leads to fake Emma fighting all of these bikers and killing the entire bar. And she's about to kill real Emma when the real Emma, not the one who's not married to Paul, stabs a pool cue in her eye. And it's revealed that the Emma that's married to Paul is an android. Why don't we call her Android? Let's do that. And Paul then emerges from the bathroom and sees these two identical women, the Android and real Emma, and is horrified. Android is distracted by, the pool cue in her eye. Real Emma and Paul escape and go to Emma's hotel room. And while they're there, they begin to talk, but then they're interrupted by Android appearing again. And she begins to fight real Emma, trying to kill her. And eventually, the knife goes flying out of fake Emma's hands, Android's hands, and lands in the wall next to Paul. Paul then pulls out the knife and tells the women to stop fighting. And both women then approach Paul and tell him to kill the other one. And Paul just stabs. Paul ended up killing the real Emma, the one he's not married to. And he and Android dispose of the body. After this, the two sit down and have a conversation. And Emma reveals that she's actually an android created by Paul's place of work, the company CCRP, in the future. And that she travelled back in time to just before Jane's death and basically took the life of real Emma. So in this timeline, the Forever and Always timeline, instead of Emma returning back to Hatchetfield after Jane's death, it was Android instead. But in every other timeline, it's real Emma. And as they're having this conversation, Paul then reveals that he's actually a clone, also created by CCRP, and that he killed the real Paul, took his place. And then the two are kind of amazed at the fact they managed to find each other, even though they're both genetically enhanced created beings, because they're both created from the real Emma and Paul's DNA. Emma's came from when real Emma sold her DNA, and Paul's DNA was taken from a coffee cup. And the two of them go off and live their best life, though they do decide they need to kill the homeless man as he's going to blow their cover. And that's the end of Forever and Always. Now we move on to the story Time Bastard, which, very importantly, takes place in the same timeline as Forever and Always. So the story opens with Ted Spankowski at the wedding reception for Android and Paul. Clone Paul? Paul 23 is his name. And Ted tries to flirt with a few of the women at the wedding, but basically strikes out and ends up at the bar, reminiscing about Jenny. And as Ted gets more and more drunk, he eventually falls asleep. And he ends up dreaming that Paul and Emma's wedding is his wedding to Jenny. And Ted is overjoyed by this. He's so happy, he's basically crying, because this is the woman he loved and he lost. Eventually they arrive at the wedding dinner, and Jenny gives Ted a little gift, and he opens it up to find this strange yellow box. And Ted is confused, he's like, what is it? And he hears a voice, and this voice goes, it's the bastards box. And suddenly no one is left at the wedding, all the food is rotting on the table, and Ted is alone. And there he comes face to face with this horrific costumed goat creature. It's the Lord in Black Tanoi Caraxis, or Tinky. And Tinky explains to Ted that this gold box is Tinky's toy box, or the bastards box, which is where Tinky keeps all his little toys, like Ted. Ted is horrified by this and wakes up from this dream, but he's also incredibly confused because this dream felt real. He felt like he was really at his wedding to Jenny. It didn't feel like a dream. Paul then comes up to Ted at the wedding and asks him if he'll go print off Paul's daily reports, as he forgot to do it, supposedly. He really just wants Ted out of the wedding. Ted goes into his office and begins to print Paul's weekly reports and complains that his printer's taking forever and it's going to take 85 years for this printing to finish. Eventually, while he's waiting for this printing to finish, Ted falls asleep, and when he wakes up, he finds himself in the year 2104, 85 years in the future. However, Ted is incredibly hungover, and he believes he's just slept through the night at work. So he goes to his usual Monday morning meeting. When he's there, he sits at the back of the room, and he watches as the scientist at the front of the room explains how the company is going to make an android using DNA from their database. They explain that this android is going to look like Emma Perkins. And Ted is kind of amused by this. He's like, you're going to make an android that looks like Paul's wife? And everyone's like, who the hell are you? And basically, because Ted doesn't exist in this time, he doesn't have the necessary identification chips that are required to kind of be identified within this society. So Ted gets tased and is locked away. Meanwhile, somewhere deep in the bowels of CCRP, a message goes across the screen of Executive Andrew Kilgore, the man who is in charge of all of CCRP's activities in the Western Hemisphere. And this man is overjoyed that Ted has arrived. Kilgore then goes upstairs to where Ted is being held and speaks to him. He tells Ted that he's been waiting for him for 100 years, and Ted has no idea what he's talking about. Kilgore then goes on to tell Ted how 85 years before, CCRP attempted to harness the power of the Lord in Black, Tinky, and while they thought the experiment didn't work, it actually created a temporal rift in Ted's office, and for some reason it worked on Ted, and Ted became aborted from the flow of time and was able to time travel. Kilgore is then absolutely fascinated about the fact that Ted is able to travel in time and wants to try and unlock the secret to time travel. So he then attempts to unravel Ted's DNA so he can find what the secret to time travel is, for some currently unknown reason. As Kilgore goes to try and kill Ted, Ted throws a chair at him and runs away. Ted then runs through CCRP and is attacked by all sorts of the different employees that work there, but eventually manages to get back to his office, but not before he steals a disintegrator off a guard and uses it on Kilgore, turning the man to dust. He then puts this device in his front pocket. Ted eventually gets back into his office and is about to go back to his old life when he realises he can go back to the day where everything changed for him. He can go back to October 17th, 2004, the day he lost Jenny, and hopefully stop her from leaving. Ted successfully time travels and managed to get back all the way to 2004 and knocks out his younger self. While young Ted thought he got too drunk, he did not. His older self knocked him out. Because time travel in the Hatchetfield universe works in the way where you always existed in the past. So the events that happened always happened. And you going back in the past cannot change that because you were always in the past. So Ted knocks out his younger self and prepares himself to go and see Jenny. However, before this, Ted goes and attacks the man that Jenny left him for, a man named Andy Kilgore. Does that name sound familiar? Could it maybe be the guy from 100 Years in the Future? And he attacks this man with a crowbar and basically mocks him and saying that Jenny belongs to him. And this completely enrages Kilgore. But the man can do nothing because he's just been hit in the head with a crowbar. Ted then goes to try and find Jenny and tries to flirt with her, but she quickly becomes very uncomfortable because after losing Jenny, Ted became this sleazy, pushy asshole. And that's not the guy that Jenny fell in love with. And eventually Jenny ends up pushing Ted away from her because she's just horrified by the way he's acting. And she accidentally sets off the disintegrator. And the beam hits her. And so Jenny slowly turns to dust in Ted's arms. And Ted is, of course, horrified by this. So he goes back to his office and tries to time travel back in time to stop her dying. But the time rift wasn't open yet because the experiment that opened the temporal rift in his office happened in 2018. So Ted is now trapped in 2004 in a universe where Jenny died. Ted is then once again tormented by Tinky, who reminds him that he's stuck there. And Tinky then shows Ted inside the bastard's box. And looking inside the box breaks Ted's mind. His mind is shattered. And suddenly Ted is no longer really Ted anymore. Ted is then thrown out of what will one day be CCRP offices. At that time, it's the Hatchetfield Gazette, as CCRP did not exist in 2004. He's thrown out of the offices and is left on the streets. And so Ted becomes the homeless man that exists within the town of Hatchetfield. And because this happens prior to the timeline splitting, when the timeline eventually splits in 2005, Ted is in this singular time span. So Ted exists as the homeless man in every single universe. Eventually, Ted catches up to the present day in the Forever and Always and Time Bastard timeline and sees Paul walking down the street with Emma the android. And Ted remembers back when he was in the future and he saw the android being made and realizes he has to warn Paul. So Ted, as the homeless man, bursts into Emma and Paul's wedding, yelling about the fact that Emma isn't Emma in exactly the same scene he did at the start of Forever and Always. And Ted is then chucked out of the wedding, again, like Forever and Always, and is left to wander the streets. However, M-Droid and clone Paul agreed that they needed to kill the homeless man as he knew Emma's secret. And so the two of them go and they murder Ted. And in death, Ted becomes forever trapped in Tinky's bastard box. Now it's time for the story, Jane's a Car. So Jane's a Car opens with Lex Foster and Ethan Green from Black Friday working in Ethan's dad's mechanic repair shop. And they're working on this car that Tom Houston had the car crash in. And Lex is sitting in the driver's seat while Ethan repairs it, when the car's radio turns on by itself and begins playing this recording in the speaker system. And it's a voice reading a spell from the Black Book. And Lex is very confused by this, and she just assumes it's a bug with the radio. So she tries to turn it off and it fails. But eventually Ethan manages to sort it out. Ethan then asks Lex to test the car to see if the work he's been doing on the engine works. So Lex turns the car on, but doesn't realise that by itself, the car has shifted into park. And so slowly the car begins rolling forwards and almost hits Ethan. But luckily, Lex manages to slam the brakes on in time. And Lex is horrified by this, but Ethan just assumes it's Lex's mistake. Meanwhile, across town, Tom and Becky and Tom's son, Tim, are at Pizza Pete's as Tom wants to introduce Tim to his definitely not girlfriend. And the group have a really great time together. And eventually, Becky comes home with them and they sit and they watch a movie together on the sofa. Tom then puts Tim to bed. And Tim encourages Tom to pursue a relationship with Becky, as he wants his dad to be happy again after his mother's death. And so Tom and Becky spend the night together that night. The next day, Tom goes and he collects his old car, the one from the car crash, from the repair shop. And the car has been in the repair shop for 1.5 years, getting put back together following the crash. The day after this, weird things start happening to Tom within the car. He was driving Tim to school and Tim left his lunch in the back seat. And the car seemingly honks by itself to remind Tim to get his lunch. And later, Tom is driving and the radio starts playing one of Jane's favourite songs. And when Tom changes the station over, it switches back to the song that was playing. And Tom is very confused by this. And eventually, he drives the car back into the garage and spends some time there just reminiscing about how this was the last place he ever saw Jane. And then he speaks to Jane, and he hears a reply. Tom is obviously horrified by this because he believes he's hallucinating his wife's voice. And so the next day, he goes to a bookshop and is looking for information on auditory hallucinations. While he's there, he bumps into everyone's favourite nurse, Becky Barnes, and Becky asks if she could maybe come over that night, and Tom says no, as he's feeling a lot of guilt about Jane and her death and how he's now pursuing a relationship with Becky, even though Jane is gone. Eventually, when Tom gets home, he rings up Tony Green, Ethan's dad, and asks about selling the car, as he feels it's stirring up too many bad memories for him. However, it's at this moment the car begins to talk to him, and it's revealed that the night of the car crash in this timeline, Tom and Jane were listening to this tape, the audio diary of one of Jane's patients, as James was a psychologist. And when the car crash happened, the audiobook was reciting a spell from the Black Book, and this spell caused Jane's soul to be transferred from her body when she died into the car. So now Jane is the car. Jane then convinces Tom to get in the car and they go for a drive together. They spend the day going around Hatchetfield and looking at different types of women, and eventually settle on the local Greenpeace girl, the woman who is constantly campaigning in Hatchetfield for Greenpeace. And Jane tries to convince Tom to run this woman over so that Jane can take over her body and become human again. And Tom is horrified by this and point blank refuses. So then Tom and Jane go home. When they eventually get home, Jane confronts Tom about Becky and how he's pursuing a relationship with her. And Tom denies it, and he says he simply ran into Becky in the bookshop and that there's nothing actually going on between them. And Jane is still very upset at Tom. And so the two then have sex. Well, the two have sex. Tom has sex with his car in order to try and distract Jane from the whole Becky situation. However, they are then interrupted by Tim, who, unknowing that his mother is the car, begins talking about Becky and how she spends time with them and how he likes her. And this angers Jane. So when Tim is gone, she insists that Tom go and break things off with Becky, or else she's going to take things into her own hands. So Tom goes to Becky's house and warns her to stay away from him. And Becky is incredibly confused by this. And once Tom gets back into the car, Jane lures Becky outside and she begins to chase her. And Becky is chased through the witchwood by this car until she's eventually hit by it while the tape recording of the Black Book is playing. And so Jane's soul is taken from the car and transferred into Becky's body. And then Tom is then arrested for hitting Becky with his car because no one believes that the car was sentient and did it himself. And they assume that Tom must have had a mental breakdown as a result of his grief. And so Becky returns home where Tim is sleeping and slowly strokes her son's hair as he sleeps. And that's the end of Jane's car! We've now arrived in the final story of Nightmare Time Season 1, which is called The Witch in the Web. And it's a big one, so buckle in. So Hannah Foster, everyone's favourite psychic teen, has been haunted by nightmares, and she's been unable to sleep and basically spends her nights playing the songs that her friend Webby taught her on her ukulele. And Hannah's mother is incredibly angered by this. Hannah is playing the ukulele at 3 a.m. in the morning, which is stopping her mother from sleeping, but also Pamela's abusive, so fuck Pamela. The next day they're visited by Hannah's social worker Duke, who decides to call in his friend Miss Holloway after Hannah tells Duke the ukulele that her sister got her has changed colours, as the ukulele that Lex gave her was white and the one she has is black. And Hannah explains that she only ever sees this black ukulele in her dreams, but now it's come into her real life. When Miss Holloway arrives and asks Hannah when her bad dreams started, Hannah explains that the dreams began when Webby went away. Hannah's protective spider friend has gone. Hannah then explains that she has to play Webby's songs on the ukulele every night before bed, or else she will forget Webby. It's then revealed that Webby disappeared around the time when Hannah's sister Lex and her boyfriend Ethan were arrested for selling drugs. At her mother's suggestion, mind you, that's the important part. And this arrest upset Hannah so much that it enabled the ghost of Willabella Muckwab to take residence in Hannah's mind. And to be able to take up residence in Hannah's mind, Willabella has blocked out Webby so that Hannah is unable to see Webby, which then means that Willabella has more power. Miss Holloway then decides that she's going to use the power of the Black Book to allow her to join Hannah in her dreams. So Hannah falls asleep, and when she awakens in her dream, she and Miss Holloway find themselves at the edge of this forest made up of tree people, the people that the hatchet men planted in Hannah's mind appear as actual people rather than trees. And the two begin to walk through the forest, and the tree people call out to Hannah, warning her that their roots that hold Willabella's soul aren't able to hold it much longer. And eventually Miss Holloway and Hannah arrive in the centre of this human forest where the witch's hut resides, at the same location where Willabella was executed. And just as they approach it, suddenly all the tree people start shouting out and screaming at Hannah, which terrifies this girl, and she loses her grip on Miss Holloway and falls through the ground. Hannah then finds herself trapped in the memory of Willabella's death. So she's being hung for crimes of witchcraft, exactly like Willabella was. And Miss Holloway warns Hannah that in her fear, she is giving Willabella power in her own mind, and that with that power, Hannah will actually die if this execution goes ahead. But Hannah is too scared and too caught up in this memory that Willabella has given her to be able to break out of it. So before Hannah can be hung, Miss Holloway grabs her and pushes Hannah through into Miss Holloway's mind. Hannah and Miss Holloway then find themselves in Miss Holloway's nightmare time, which is a nightmare version of the Starlight Theatre. And in there, Hannah and Miss Holloway encounter this creature that's made up of 3 forms melded together, which are, according to Miss Holloway, are the 3 girls she was unable to save. Hannah and Miss Holloway then begin to walk towards the stage where the exit back to Hannah's mind is. And as they do, Hannah hears all of these voices that begin calling out to her, and she manages to ignore them until she finds one that chills her to a bone, the voice of Wiggly. And suddenly Hannah finds herself alone on the stage and Miss Holloway is gone, and on the floor is this skeleton. And without meaning to, Hannah uses her power to cause this skeleton to rise from the dead, and then in front of her she finds Wilbur Cross. And Wilbur, obviously, as a disciple of Wiggly, is very interested in Willabella being able to take over Hannah's mind, and this will give Willabella life again. And so Wilbur tries to kill Hannah in order to assist Willabella in taking over Hannah's mind. But he's stopped by Miss Holloway. So Wilbur and Holloway then begin to fight once more, like they did all the way back in 2005, as Hannah escapes. And Wilbur's about to win this fight as he possesses the form of Hannah's mother in the real world and begins choking Miss Holloway's body. However, Hannah is horrified to see Miss Holloway in pain, and so without meaning to sends this psychic wave which blasts through this Miss Holloway's mind and basically gets rid of Wilbur and forcibly ejects Miss Holloway from her dream. However, this leads to Hannah having to fight on her own. Following this, Hannah awakens in a bright and happy version of her own room, and then her sister pokes her head round the door and tells Hannah that they let her go, and she's returned to Hannah. And Lex brings Hannah all sorts of games and toys and even a puppy. And Hannah is a bit confused by this because she's desperately trying to remember another gift that Lex gave her, and she knows it reminds her of Webby, but she can't remember who Webby is. All she knows it reminded her of a friend. And upon Hannah asking for more gifts, Lex assumes that Hannah wants more dolls. So Lex begins pulling out these 5 dolls, the dolls of the Lords in Black. And Hannah is horrified by this. And Lex then begins talking about how the Lords in Black are Webby's brothers and how they're her gods that she worships. And it's at this point that Hannah realizes this isn't her sister. This is Willabella Muckwab. Willabella then tries to attack Hannah in order to be able to take over her mind, but Hannah finds her ukulele, which is a symbol of her love for her sister and her connection to Webby, and so she uses this ukulele to destroy Willabella's stronghold in her mind. And in destroying Willabella's stronghold, Hannah allows Webby to return to her. And Webby is incredibly angry that Willabella tried to hurt Hannah, and so she destroys her soul. Hannah then wakes up and informs Miss Holloway that she won and that the witch is gone and that nightmare time is over. Miss Holloway then promises Hannah that she's going to help get Lex and Ethan out of prison and send her mother to prison instead. After this, Miss Holloway then goes to leave, but before she does, she gives Hannah a magic hat. and tells her that nothing can harm her while it's on her head. And that was the end of the first season of Nightmare Time. And now we're going to take a brief interlude to talk about a one-off special episode of Nightmare Time we got as part of the Backer Kit campaign for Nerdy Prudes Must Die. So on a live stream, StarKid did this live reading of a bonus Nightmare Time story called Hey Melissa. And I'm going to give you a quick rundown of that now. So basically, Hey Melissa follows the secretary in the CCRP technical department, Melissa, as she essentially kidnaps Ted and Paul and forces them to be pets in her house. Because Melissa believes that men are not actually human and that they're actually just like dogs in human suits. So initially she kidnaps Ted and she cuts off his fingers so he has like paws and forces him to live in a cage, you know, like a dog. And then Melissa eventually kidnaps Paul as well. And she initially thinks Paul is a dog, but then Paul convinces Melissa that he's a cat so that Melissa won't cut off his fingers. So then Ted and Paul are forced to live as a cat and dog in Melissa's house, and they keep trying to escape and they cannot. Eventually, Melissa is joined by some of her other friends who also believe that men are animals. And while this happens, Melissa gets distracted and fails to lock the door properly. And while this happens, Paul attempts to escape, but Ted refuses to escape because he's a weirdo. And so he basically alerts the women to Paul trying to escape. So the women then come in and they basically lock Paul in the cage and give Ted a special surprise in which they murder him. So Ted dies. Ted always dies. This is not news. Eventually, Bill arrives at Melissa's house because he's concerned about Melissa, as he believes Paul is leading her on. But in Bill's arrival enables Paul to be able to stage an escape. So he manages to escape from Melissa's house and is struck by a car, which Melissa is horrified by because she believes that her cat has died. But it turns out Melissa is part of a organisation called the Kitty Cat Club, who are a group of women that regularly kidnap men and force them to act as animals. And Melissa is arrested by the FBI, specifically an FBI agent who was working at CCRP named Freddie Biggs. Following this, Paul is then taken to hospital to, recover from being hit by a car. However, Paul has spent so much time with Melissa that he's developed Stockholm Syndrome. So Paul helps Melissa escape from the police and basically agrees that he's gonna go to his job every day and earn money for them to live together. But when he's not at work, Paul will act as Melissa's cat at home. And that's how the story ends. So I just thought I'd pop that in here because it doesn't really have any important lore, but it is a part of the Hatchetfield series. So, yeah. That's Hey Melissa! Now we're going to move on to the fourth and final, as of right now, installment in the Hatchetfield series, Nightmare Time Season 2.
You can't run if I don't catch you, but the Nightmare Time already caught you.
The first story in Nightmare Time Episode 2 is called Honey Queen. Now, if you remember all the way back when I talked about the Church of the Starry Children, you might be able to figure out where this one is going. So this story follows Linda Monroe from Black Friday and opens with her going to visit her father for dinner. And throughout this entire dinner with her father, Linda is constantly belittled by him. He calls her this affectionate nickname, Piglet, which Linda absolutely hates. And he constantly just basically mocks and belittles Linda and everything she's achieved in life. And while doing this, her father, Roman, constantly goes on and on about how great the Hatchetfield Honey Queen is. So that night, as she drives home, Linda decides she's going to run for the Honey Queen pageant and she's going to win because she believes that winning will earn her father's respect. Linda goes to sign up for the pageant, and when she's there, she bumps into local barista and amateur actress Zoe Chambers, Emma's co-worker from The Guy Who Didn't Like Musicals, the one who was having the affair with Sam, the police officer. And Zoe immediately insults Linda and constantly calls her names, while Linda did try and stop Zoe from signing up for the pageant by claiming that her father's on the committee. It didn't work, and basically Zoe just told Linda not to fuck with her. So now they're enemies. Yay! That night, Linda's husband Gerald finds her in the garden, trying and failing to toss a baton, as she explains that she needs to have a skill for the festival so that she can win. And Linda doesn't think she's going to be able to win because she doesn't think she's talented enough. And that's when Gerald suggests to Linda that she cheats to win. So over the next week, Linda and Gerald work together to basically sabotage the rest of the competition in the Honey Queen pageant. They organise this boat trip that results in this woman being stranded in the middle of the ocean. She gets Gerald, who's a plastic surgeon, to cancel this woman's plastic surgery. She frames this woman, God forbid, from being from Clydesdale, which is the worst thing you can ever be in Hatchetfield, and many other things. Linda eventually eliminates all of her competition except for Zoe Chambers. And Zoe has a lot of things going on in her life. While Linda is desperately trying to sabotage every single woman in Hatchetfield, it seems, Zoe has spent her time visiting her grandmother in her retirement home. And you might think, that's nice of Zoe. Gosh, no. Zoe wants the inheritance money, and that's it. She does not give a shit about her grandma. And Zoe will do anything to get this inheritance money, including outing her brother to her homophobic grandmother so he gets written out the will. She's my comfort homophobe. What can I say? I love her. And after visiting her grandma, Zoe is picked up by Sam, the man who's married to Charlotte, and the two of them go to the Witchwood Forest and end up hooking up and smoking a joint together. However, unknowingly to Zoe, a man is hidden in the bushes taking photos of them. A photographer that was hired by Linda Monroe. So the next day, Linda takes these photos and shows them to Zoe and basically threatens to show Zoe's grandmother these photos unless Zoe drops out of the pageant. And Zoe is immediately horrified because if her grandmother sees these photos, she will cut her out the will. So now everything Zoe has done to try and get this money will be out the window. So that night, Zoe sends Sam, her married cop boyfriend, to go to her grandmother's retirement home and say that he needs to ask Miranda, Zoe's grandmother, a few questions. Naturally, of course, Sam does not do that. And what he does instead is he adjusts the medication, dosages on Miranda's sheet. So she's given the wrong medication and she dies. So now Linda can't use these photos against Zoe because Zoe's already inherited her grandmother's money because she died. So Linda is absolutely furious that Zoe has outsmarted her. And so she decides to do one last ditch effort to try and sabotage Zoe's chances at the Honey Queen pageant. What Linda does is she hires Ted, the homeless man version of Ted, to act as a casting director and sends him and Gerald into Beanie's, the coffee shop where Zoe worked, to make Zoe want to sing a lot the day before the pageant in order to impress this casting director. And so Zoe spends the entire day singing for hours and hours on end in the hopes of impressing this Broadway casting director that's going to offer her a part. And because of that, the day of the pageant arrives and Zoe has no voice left. The skill that Zoe was going to present was her singing. So Zoe is immediately horrified by this. She's even more horrified when Linda reveals that it was actually her that sabotaged Zoe's voice and was the reason that Zoe is not able to sing. However, Zoe is determined to win this pageant, you see, because Zoe believes that the woman who is the Honey Queen goes on to bigger and better things and leaves Hatchetfield forever. Zoe desperately wants to be on Broadway. It's the only thing she cares about. She doesn't care about Sam. She doesn't care about Hatchetfield. All she wants is to be on Broadway. So Zoe, much like Linda, continues to play dirty. Zoe blackmails the teenager in charge of handing out the questions into purposefully giving her an easy question, which she answers flawlessly, impressing all of the judges. And she also forces him to give Linda a really, really difficult question. However, Linda then bribes Professor Higgins, who is hosting the pageant, to help her answer this question and to help her win the pageant. Because if he does so, she'll help him fund his musical. It all comes back to the musical. However, even with Higgins' help, Linda bombs the question part. And then it comes time for the talent portion of the pageant. Zoe has been desperately trying to heal her voice this entire time, and she uses honey with tea and everything. And she goes on stage and tries to sing, and her voice is not there. She cannot do it. And Linda is overjoyed by this. And Linda then goes on to absolutely slay her talent portion. She performs this song called Queen Bee, and it's a banger. So now Zoe kind of has the higher ground in terms of the question section, but Linda is living her best life in the talent section. So they're kind of neck and neck. However, after seeing Linda's performance, Zoe is stressing about this competition. So she gets Sam to kidnap River, Linda's youngest child, and put him in his car. Zoe then goes up to Linda and basically tells her that if she ever wants to see her son again, she has to drop out the competition. And Linda is rightfully horrified by this because Zoe's, kidnapped her son, her favourite son, because Linda is let's not forget Linda's a terrible person. She has a favourite son. So Linda then begins attacking Zoe and eventually manages to get her hand on her phone. She calls her husband Gerald and tells him that River has been kidnapped and tells him to go outside and find them. And then she steals Zoe's phone and texts Sam, who has River in the car, and basically gets him to reveal himself to Gerald. So while the women are fighting inside, Sam and Gerald get into a fight outside, which eventually leads to Gerald running Sam over with his car and killing him. However, this is not before Sam shoots Gerald several times, also killing him. So both Zoe's boyfriend and Linda's husband are dead. And while this is all happening, Linda and Zoe are still fighting each other backstage at the Honey Queen pageant. And they eventually find their way up into the rafters, where Linda wraps a rope around Zoe's neck, but then Zoe manages to push Linda off the platform, so she's hanging by her fingertips over the stage and is about to fall. However, just as Zoe is about to knock Linda's remaining hand that she's holding onto the rafters with off their beam, Linda pulls the sandbag off the platform, which causes the rope around Zoe's neck to go taut, and Zoe dies from being hung. After this, Linda is crowned the Honey Queen, and her father comes up to her and tells her that he's incredibly proud of her, and then he takes her into the woods. Now you see, the reason Linda won Honey Queen was not because she was the best performer or answered the best questions. The reason Roman explains to Linda is because she wanted it the most. She was the hungriest. And it is that makes the Honey Queen the sweetest woman in Hatchetfield. As the hunger that she feels in wanting to become the Honey Queen is what makes her so sweet to Nibley when he eats her. So then Linda is taken into the woods by her father and sacrificed to a dark god and is given to him as a little snack. And that is how Honey Queen ends. Story is called Perky's Buds, and it follows Emma Perkins as she finally manages to get the pot farm she so desperately wanted. However, this pot farm has a problem in that it's absolutely infested with these birds called nighthawks that keep eating Emma's crops. So Emma and her farmhand Ziggs, you should remember from Watchworld, spend much of their time basically attempting to shoot these birds in order to stop them eating the weed. However, obviously, a weed farm isn't the most popular thing for the people of Hatchetfield, and so a few people stage protests outside, namely Grace Chastity and her friend Gabe. Grace Chastity is an important character, you should remember her. She's one of the leads of Nerdy Prudes Must Die. And so Emma and Ziggs go and see Grace and Gabe outside the gates of Perky's Buds where they're protesting, and basically just get them to leave. They put a bag of manure in a wood chipper and chuck it at them, and Gabe and Grace are horrified and leave. However, the next day, Emma and Ziggs are approached by the Metzger family, and the Metzger family are descended from the Hatchetmen. Remember them from all the way back in the beginning in 1824? The tree guys? They're back! Because you see, Emma built her farm on a plot of land she inherited from her parents, who inherited it from Emma's grandfather. And this plot of land is in Witchwood Forest. the place where the Hatchetmen plant the trees. And so in cutting down all of these trees, Emma has essentially released all of this magic back into the world, and the Hatchetmen are not happy. So they basically tell Emma she has to pack up her entire farm and leave, or they're going to do something about it. And Emma's like, I'm not gonna cave to your threats, leave me alone. And Ziggs is like, yeah, hell yeah, we're not gonna cave to some Republicans. And so the Metzger family leave Emma and Ziggs to their weed. That night, Emma and Ziggs are enjoying their produce, if you will, in the farmhouse. And Emma explains to Ziggs how the reason she set up farm in the Witchwood is because the soil is super fertile and causes everything that grows there to grow big and fast and different. And Emma explains to Ziggs about how it's really difficult to grow weed typically, but in Witchwood Forest, they have no problem. However, it is while they are having this conversation that the farmhouse is suddenly invaded by the Metzger family. And they grab Emma and Ziggs and bury them up to their neck in the ground. Why, you ask? Because they're annoyed Emma cut down the trees. So they're going to make Emma and Ziggs the first batch of new trees at this grove. But however, just before Emma and Ziggs are turned into tree people, the Metzger family are suddenly attacked by legions of the nighthawk birds that have been invading the farm. And it turns out that these birds, having eaten the weeds that grew from the magic soil in the Witchwood, have gained psychic abilities. So now they have the ability to communicate with humans, and they're desperate for more weed to eat as it gets them high, and also gives them supernatural powers. So the birds essentially force Emma and Ziggs to work non-stop and harvest and grow all of this wheat for them. And they basically treat them like animals. Like, they force them to shit on the floor instead of going to the farmhouse to use the toilet. And then that night, they make them sleep in the barn. So as you can probably guess, Emma and Ziggs are not too happy about this. So what they do is, together, they decide to make a scarecrow, which they stick in the field in order to distract the birds. And it works initially. And the birds are entranced by this mysterious figure who just stands in the field. And they don't entirely understand why the person's not doing anything. And they're scared by it. And so while the birds are distracted, Emma and Ziggs make a break for the car. They manage to get in the car and set off just as the birds notice that they're gone. So Emma and Ziggs are desperately trying to drive away from the farm and get back into the town to get some help. But the birds are much faster than them. And eventually the car is swarmed by birds. And Ziggs is then taken by the birds while Emma manages to escape. And she manages to make it to the main road, where she bumps into Grace Chastity again. And Emma begs Grace for help, but Grace basically says, you made this bed, lie in it, because Grace is not a fan of Emma's weird business. And so Grace just leaves Emma to her fate with the birds. Eventually the birds do find Emma and they swarm her and knock her out. And Emma reawakens in the barn. Emma reawakens in the barn where the birds reveal that their psychic powers have reached such a level now that they are able to possess humans. And these birds essentially possess Ziggs to begin attacking Emma. Emma attempts to fight Ziggs off. Emma is successful for a time being and manages to grab the lighter out of Ziggs's back pocket and set fire to the barn that they're in, which immediately distracts the birds and breaks their control on Ziggs. So Ziggs is able to get their brain back. Emma then grabs a burning beam and takes it into the weed field and burns all of the weed, which causes almost all of the birds to get so high that they just basically burn to death because they've got nothing else to do. The only bird that doesn't die from basically being burnt is the leader of the Nighthawk flock, a bird called Ezekiel. And Ezekiel has a larger psychic ability than the rest of the birds, as he's able to gain the ability of telekinesis, which enables him to make objects float. So Ezekiel gets all of the guns from Emma and Ziggs's weapon store and then begins hunting Emma and Ziggs throughout the house. However, prior to the Metzgers invading, Emma and Ziggs have been working on a brand new logo for Emma's weed company, Perky's Buds. And so they use that model to essentially trick Ezekiel into shooting this painting. And then they grab the bird and put him through the wood chipper so he's dead. However, by this point, the fire on the farm has grown to such a level that Emma and Ziggs are not going to be able to escape this. And so the two of them get onto the roof of the farmhouse and basically smoke a last joint together before they inevitably burn to death. However, a girl named Grace Chastity, upon being harassed by M. Perkins in the street, rang the police. And so police and firemen show up to try and help to save Emma and Ziggs, and also to arrest them. Because you see, the checkered-tailed nighthawk, the bird that Ezekiel and the rest of the nighthawk flock are an endangered species. And so in killing them, Emma and Ziggs have violated the law. So as a result of this, Emma and Ziggs get arrested, and that's how the story ends. The next story is a story called Abstinence Camp, which essentially acts as kind of like an introduction to all of the characters in Nerdy Prudes Must Die. So get ready to meet your new besties. The story opens with Stephanie Laughter, the mayor's daughter, throwing up in a toilet at Hatchetfield High because she's been out partying the night before and has basically got the worst hangover ever. And Steph isn't alone in this bathroom. She's also in there with a girl named Grace Chastity, who leans over the stall and asks Steph if she's okay. And through some miscommunication, this conversation essentially results in Grace believing that Steph is pregnant. A rumour which she then spreads round the school. Now, obviously a rumour that a girl's pregnant when she's not is never good, especially when, you know, you're a teenager. But this is especially bad for Steph, as this rumour starts going around the entire town. And Steph's dad is the mayor, who is up for re-election that year. So Solomon, Steph's father, is obsessed with his image and will do anything to try and get support and votes. So in order to stop the rumour that Steph is pregnant spreading around Hatchetfield, Solomon decides to send his daughter to Abstinence Camp, the local summer camp that takes place every year in Witchwood Forest. Now, another person who is attending Abstinence Camp that year is a boy named Pete Spankowski. Pete is the brother of the one and only Ted Spankowski. And so Ted drives Pete to Abstinence Camp and tells him about how he used to have to go to this camp when he was younger, because clearly it worked so well. So the teens arrive at the camp and are assigned blue or pink t-shirts depending on their gender. The group of teens are then introduced to the camp counsellors, Boy Jerry and Girl Jerry, who are voluntarily celibate adults, who are the most horny people you will ever meet. Now, through being the only two kind of not extremely religious people at the camp, Steph and Pete become friends quite quickly as they support each other and basically just take the piss out of all of the events and things that are going on. And so they quickly become friends and hang out a bit. For example, one evening, Gabe, Grace Chastity's friend, Grace is also at the camp, tells a ghost story about Lumberax, the Mad Woodsman. What they say about this is how Lumberax basically watches over the camp and kills people who are not celibate, including people who kiss, even couples that are just simply kissing. He's like, no, this is not allowed, and he kills them. And Steph and Pete are rightfully kind of a bit like, well, that story is a bit of bullshit. They're wrong, but that's how they react. Following this ghost story, Gabe then confesses to Grace that he has feelings for her, and she is completely oblivious to this. And basically, Gabe ends up masturbating to try and get over Grace, which results in him being killed by Lumberax, because Lumberax is real. And the next day, Girl Jerry and Boy Jerry find Gabe's body and bury it in the woods, because this has been happening for years, and they're just covering it up. And while Boy Jerry and Girl Jerry are doing this, Steph decides she's going to go for a shower. And she arrives there and finds Grace Chastity also in the shower. However, you see, Grace showers in her bathing suit because that's the camp policy, as they don't want these teenagers being naked as they're trying to promote abstinence. And Steph is disgusted by this, obviously. So she attempts to go into the shower naked, which Grace is not having. So Steph leaves the girls' shower rooms and heads to the boys just so she can get away from Grace. And who would be inside these boys' shower rooms but Peter Spankowski? And so Steph and Pete begin showering in separate cubicles, and then they begin discussing Lumberax, and they jokingly suggest that they should test if he's real by showering together. And then these jokes slowly become more and more real. And Steph is just about to jump into the same shower as Pete, which would have got both of them killed by Lumberax, when they're interrupted by Boy and Girl Jerry, who have been alerted by Grace Chastity. While this is happening, out in the woods, two of the other campers, Noah and Mary, begin making out with one another, which results in them both being killed. So after their little shower stunt, Steph and Pete are put in solitary confinement for the rest of the summer. And Grace protests this a lot because she thinks that Steph won't be able to get better if she can't participate in camp. So Grace decides she's going to protest this and decides to go to Boy and Girl Jerry's office. Boy and Girl Jerry have just arrived in their office when they discover the body parts of Noah and Mary have just been like deposited on their desk. Obviously they're horrified at the fact that these children are dying, but it turns out that Boy and Girl Jerry want each other. They want to explore each other's bodies, but they're both voluntarily celibate, so they're doing weird shit like smelling each other. It's insane. And so they become so engrossed in each other they forget about the dead bodies on the table. Until Grace walks in and finds the dead bodies. So Grace then runs away because obviously she's just seen the dead bodies of her friends and is like, what the hell? Well, no, actually, Grace would probably be more like, what the heck? Because she's a Christian. Meanwhile, Steph and Pete decide to escape from solitary confinement and try and go back to Hatchetfield and just escape from abstinence camp altogether. So they go into the woods. And as they're going into the woods, they spot Boy Jerry burying Noah and Mary. And they're, obviously horrified. And Boy Jerry spots them. So Pete and Steph basically fight off Boy Jerry. And after this, they kiss each other. Which causes lumberjacks to come and find them and chase them through the woods. Now, while this is happening, Grace is being chased by Girl Jerry, who explains to Grace that lumberjacks is actually her and Boy Jerry's child, who was born out of wedlock. And because they were both abstinence camps counselors, Girl Jerry raised her baby, Lil Jerry, in the wood. But because of the properties of the witchwood, Lil Jerry grew up much like Emma's weed, big, fast, large, and different. And so while Girl Jerry tried to teach him about abstinence, he took this too far and started murdering campers in order to ensure that the woods remained celibate. And while this conversation is happening, Grace and Girl Jerry hear a scream from Steph and Pete. And Grace runs off to try and help. So eventually, Pete and Steph are about to be killed by lumberjacks when Grace intervenes and steps between them. And Lumberjacks refuses to kill her because she's not done anything wrong. And Grace reveals to Lumberjacks that his parents had him out of wedlock, which results in Lumberjacks killing Boy Jerry and Girl Jerry for their sins. And after this, it seems like Lumberjacks is about to try and kill Steph and Pete again, but Grace still refuses to leave. And so Lumberjacks gives her his axe, which results in Grace ruling the camp and basically controlling everyone by just wielding an axe. And it's the most celibate the camp has ever been. And that's how the story ends. The next story is called Daddy. I'm not kidding, that's the full name. Follows the owner of the toy store from Black Friday, Frank Priceley, as he desperately tries to keep Toy Zone open while facing the onset of online retailers shutting down malls and things. And his toy store has become so empty to the point that the only person coming in is Sherman Young, the son of Sheila Young. And Sherman buys so many toys from Frank, and eventually one day his mother comes in and invites Frank to dinner at her house. And Frank agrees. And Frank goes to her house and they have a nice dinner together. And while they're there, Sheila proposes to Frank. Like, full on was just like, let's get married. And she tells Frank that she simply wants a relationship and she will happily use her fortune to fund Toy Zone. Frank agrees and the two get married, resulting in Frank becoming Sherman's father. And Frank is immediately annoyed by how much Sheila babies Sherman, because she does things like taking the crunchy cereal pieces out of his cereal, which Frank is just horrified by. And Frank eventually protests against this, which causes Sheila to force Frank to take the cereal pieces out, leaving only the squishy marshmallows of Sherman's cereal. However, Frank misses a piece, and Sherman bites into a crunchy piece, and Sheila flips out. She thinks that maybe part of Sherman's tooth will have cracked off and just basically have harmed him permanently. So they go to the hospital, and Sherman is said to be fine. But when Sherman is discharged, he does not want to see his mum. He wants to see Frank. his father. And Sheila is incredibly jealous of this. And so when they get home, she locks Frank out of the house and forces him to basically spend the night outside in the rain and the cold. Eventually, Frank manages to climb up and get in through an upstairs window and begins packing his bags and tells Sheila that he's going to leave her because this behaviour is insane. And Sheila is not having that. She tells Frank that no one walks out on Sheila Young and locks Frank in her basement dungeon, which is essentially just a section of the Hatchetfield sewer that she's gated off. While he's down there, Frank finds another man who used to be married to Linda, named Barry. Now, Barry is very gravely injured. He's got this infected gash on his leg and it's slowly killing him. And Frank attempts to escape, but there is no way out of this sewer and he and Barry are essentially trapped there. Meanwhile, Sheila finally decides that she's ready to go and find a new husband again and goes and finds Ted Spankowski. However, Sherman keeps begging his mother to let him go to Toy Zone to get some more toys because he keeps forgetting that Frank is in the basement, so can't open the store. So Sherman goes down to the basement to ask Frank to give him the keys to Toy Zone. And Frank explains that he can't by completely lying through his teeth and essentially gets Sherman back on Frank's side again and convinces Sherman to let Frank be his father again. And when Sherman hugs him, Frank pickpockets Sherman's keys to the dungeon, which basically allows him to finally get out of the dungeon. However, he's too late and his friend Barry had already died from his infection. So eventually Sheila returns home with her new potential husband, Ted, and Sherman is not having it. He point blank refuses and convinces his mother to get Frank back as her husband. And she agrees, so she shoots Ted, so he's not a problem anymore. And then Linda goes down to the basement to find Frank and finds that he's escaping. However, she then holds him at gunpoint and forces him back into the house. Sheila is incredibly angry at this point, and so she takes Frank to a room in her house which has an altar and ties him down to it. And Sheila then explains to Frank how her husband, Mr. Young, gave her the gift of eternal life by stealing other people's life forces. And Sheila then attempts to steal Frank's life force, but is unable to because the copies of this spell she had, Sherman had drawn all over in order to prevent his mother from reading them. And this acts as a test for Sheila, which she fails and basically shows that she doesn't love her son. And Sherman is the only one who knows the spell, as he memorized it before he drew on the sheets. And so Sherman, instead of taking Frank's life force, takes his mother's life force and uses it to turn himself back into a young child again. And then he tells Frank he will have to look after him. He basically tells Frank that Frank is going to become his caregiver for the rest of his life, or else he will kill him. And that's the end of the story. The next story is Killer Track. Begins with a girl named Rose who has just finished performing with her rock band Knee Deep Beast at this bar when she's approached by a guy named Kale. And Kale and Rose kind of flirt a little bit before Rose joins him in his van. And Kale essentially tells her that he has this song that she can listen to, and if she listens to it, supposedly within 1 week she will die. And because this is a horror series, of course Rose listens to this song. And then just under a week later, Duke the social worker arrives to Rose's house after she's caused extreme damages to a load of musical equipment at this music shop she was visiting because she kept being haunted by the song that Kale played her. And so Rose is genuinely beginning to believe that because she listened to this song, she is going to die the next day. And Rose doesn't expect anyone to believe her, but Duke arrives and he brings evidence of other people that have been affected by this and convinces Rose to come with him to see Miss Holloway. While Rose is initially skeptical of Miss Holloway, she eventually agrees to let her help her. And so Miss Holloway uses the Black Book to channel the powers of Tinky, the time powers, to create a time paradox in which Miss Holloway placed herself in Rose's position in the car, so Rose never heard the song, but Miss Holloway did. And as a result of this, when Miss Holloway returned to the present time, a week after the time Rose heard the song, she will die. So Rose and Duke and Miss Holloway begin to prep for this song to begin haunting Miss Holloway by locking away any equipment that can make sound. So the speakers can't play any sound, so therefore she should not be able to be killed by the sound, as there is nothing to make the sound. There's nothing to play the song. However, what they forget is that the human voice box is also capable of hearing sound. So when the time comes, Miss Holloway essentially hears the song coming from Rose and Duke's voice boxes, and she dies. And Duke is incredibly in love with Miss Holloway, so he is devastated by this, until he reads Miss Holloway's letter that essentially tells him to not call an ambulance and to not take her body to the morgue. The two things that Duke did immediately after she died. So Duke then goes to the morgue in the hospital to try and find Miss Holloway and her body. And he witnesses Miss Holloway essentially return from the dead. And she's like, I'm back, I'm here, I'm slaying, I'm living my best 80s life. And Duke is confused. He's like, what on earth just happened? And he demands Miss Holloway tell him everything and tell him the whole story. And so she does. Except Duke cannot remember it after she's finished. And the reason for this is because Miss Holloway has a curse on her where she is unable to share any of her past with people. And the things that she does share, the people lose all memory of it. Such as Miss Holloway explaining to Duke why she's essentially immortal. After this, Miss Holloway then explains to Duke that she thinks she knows where the killer track is going to strike next. And so the two of them go to the Hatchetfield Honey Festival in the hope of stopping the song being played. Once they arrive at the Honey Festival, Duke and Miss Holloway split up to try and find the place where the song is going to be played from, as they believe it's probably going to be played over the speaker systems in order to kill as many people as possible. Another person performing at the Honey Festival is Rose's rock band, Needy Beast. So when Rose sees Kale snooping around the Honey Festival, she's incredibly confused because by all logic, he should be dead too as he heard the song. So Rose goes and confronts Kale. And Kale essentially tells her that he has been selected by the killer track to act as its host and to be the one person that isn't killed by it. And instead, he simply just exist to spread the song. Kale then essentially begs Rose to try and stop him from playing the song over the speakers at the festival, but Rose is too late. And so the song blasts through the entire speaker system. However, Miss Holloway has a plan. She hops onto the stage and begins to play a song from her past when she was an 80s pop star. And this song then drowns out the killer track over the speaker system, which means that by the time that the Miss Holloway song has finished, all of the people who heard the killer track forget that they heard it, so it can't affect them anymore. And then after this, Duke manages to rush in and stop Kale by punching him before he can play the song again. Duke then destroys the phone, which basically destroys Kale at the same time, meaning that the killer track can't be played anymore, and that everyone has won. However, due to Duke reporting Miss Holloway's death to the authorities, pretty much everyone in town knows that Miss Holloway died, which means that Holloway isn't able to keep up her current identity as Miss Holloway, which she's had since 2005. So she tells Duke that she's going to have to take on a new identity. And because Miss Holloway will then become part of her past, she explains that Duke will essentially forget who she is and what she looks like. And Duke is devastated by this, but there's nothing he can do about it. And so Miss Holloway kisses Duke and then disappears. And suddenly all Duke remembers is that he had a friend who died. And then a few months later, Duke pulls into the parking lot of Hatchetfield High, where he meets the brand new guidance counsellor at Hatchetfield High, a lady named Miss Holiday. And she seems familiar to him, but he can't entirely place it. And they do have a bit of a conversation, and Miss Holloway leaves. And that's how that story ends. Something that's important to note is that all of the stories in Nightmare Time Season 2 take place within one singular timeline. So all of the events happen concurrently. So while Emma and Ziggs are having a bit of a nightmare with the birds, Linda's trying to win the honey queen pageant. It all kind of links together. And I think that's really cool. And now we're on to the final story of Nightmare Time Season 2, which is called Yellow Jacket. Now this story follows Hannah Foster, everyone's favourite psychic teen. I need to stop saying that, it's not her tagline. The story starts with Hannah in shop class using a bandsaw to work on her project, when she suddenly is hit by a vision of this boxing ring in some random place and this boy that's getting beaten up there. And so Hannah's mind is not in shop class where she's using this saw. As she's pushing this piece of wood through the machine, her fingers get closer and closer to the blade. And so while Hannah is in this vision, she accidentally chops off her finger using the bandsaw. She's immediately rushed to hospital and the finger is reattached. But when her sister Lex arrives, she's faced with an insane amount of medical debt that she cannot afford as Hannah's primary caregiver on a salary from Toy Zone. And so suddenly this debt becomes very stressful for her and there's not much she can do to get out of it. That night, Hannah summons her friend Webby, and Webby initially tries to comfort Hannah by playing mock sleepovers and appearing as multiple different personalities, but this ultimately just ends up annoying Hannah, and the two get into an argument, with Hannah calling Webby useless as she can't actually help with any real life problems such as money, and Webby leaves feeling upset. A few weeks later, Lex completely forgets about Hannah's birthday because she's so stressed about their medical debt and all things like that, but Ethan remembers. And so he takes Hannah to Pizza Pete's to celebrate her birthday. And while they're there, they go on this arcade game where Hannah has to press the button so the machine stops at the right time. And Hannah then begins using her powers to do this. So she gets the best score every time and wins millions and millions of tickets, which they then use to redeem an iPad from the toy cabinet. However, while this all may seem just like fun and games to Hannah, in an office at the back of Pizza Pete's, a man named Eddie Chip Lucky is watching Hannah and realizes that she has powers. So Eddie then comes and invites Ethan and Hannah into his office, and he essentially tells Ethan that Hannah is incredibly gifted, which, I mean, we all knew this, and explains to Ethan how, because Hannah is 15 at this point, her powers are currently at their peak, as after 15 the powers begin to dim. And he then offers Hannah a way to make a lot of money. Eddie takes Hannah and Ethan to what used to be the Hatchetfield Roller-Rama, which is now turned into an underground supernatural fight ring. That night, there's a match going on between a girl named Spitfire, who has the ability to shoot fire out of her hands, and a boy named Stopwatch, who's able to stop time by holding his breath. Hannah and Ethan and Eddie watch this fight a significant amount of time, and eventually Spitfire wins. And Eddie then offers Ethan the ability to let Hannah fight in this ring. And Hannah is all for it because she wants to make money in order to help Lex with her medical expenses. But Ethan is not having it, and he point blank refuses. So while this is happening, Lex rushes to her high school equivalency exam, and it's midway through the exam that she realizes she forgot Hannah's birthday. And this causes her to stress so much that she essentially fails the test. And she then runs to try and get Hannah something for her birthday, and manages to get a small cupcake in a balloon. So when Hannah and Ethan return, Lex just is generally feeling terrible that she forgot Hannah's birthday and that she couldn't have done more for her sister. And Lex then goes to bed. It's this amount of stress and the reaction Lex had to how she forgot Hannah's birthday that eventually convinces Ethan to let Hannah fight in the ring. After this decision, Hannah then has her first fight, which is up against Spitfire from the fight before. And she's given this special concoction called Mind Milk, which essentially just enhances all of Hannah's natural abilities and makes her powers significantly stronger. And then Hannah enters the fight ring with Spitfire, and initially Hannah is not doing so great. She's all over the place and Spitfire seems to be winning, until Hannah, with the power of her mind, essentially switches off Spitfire's powers, leaving her basically powerless. However, it is at this point that Hannah then begins to notice another presence watching her, and she accidentally reaches out with her mind and finds this creature named Otho watching her from this private viewing box. Hannah is then returned back to the fight by Spitfire, essentially trying to punch Hannah in order to get her to fall out of the ring so that she can win. Hannah then apologizes to Spitfire that she has to start fighting now, and blasts the girl out of the arena with a psychic blast. After this, Hannah is approached by the rest of the kids from the Roller-Rama, including Spitfire, and all of them become friends and go roller skating together. The next day, Lex is working at Toy Zone when her boss tells her he received a call from Ethan, who told Lex to meet him at a new apartment complex. So Lex does this and finds Hannah and Ethan in this beautiful, massive, absolutely massive apartment. And Ethan and Hannah tell Lex how they won $100,000 from the stock market and that their lives are now set. Lex is obviously overjoyed by this, as she's been so stressed by money. So then she and Ethan happily spend the night together. And while they're there, Lex suggests to Ethan that she might get Hannah looked at by a psychiatrist, as she fears that there might be something wrong with Hannah because of her blackout with her vision that she had during shop class. When Ethan questions why Lex wants to get Hannah evaluated, Lex explains that it's because Hannah still sees Webby. It's at this point that Ethan realizes that Webby is probably real and is a manifestation of Hannah's powers. And he's even more interested when he finds out that Lex used to see Webby when she was little as well, as he begins to realize that Lex also has powers. So while this is happening, all the way across town, a man named Charles comes up to his prize fight winner, Otho, and tells him that he wants him to fight against Spitfire in the next match. And Otho is kind of irritated by this and requests Charles that he lets him fight against Hannah. Charles is irritated by this as he spent a lot of money arranging a fight between Spitfire and Otho, but he agrees that if Otho does this fight, he'll try and organise a fight against Yellowjacket. Meanwhile, across town, Ethan attempts to propose to Lex, but it keeps going wrong and he doesn't actually end up doing it. And one of the interruptions that Ethan faces is Eddie arriving at their penthouse, offering Hannah a new fight. Hannah immediately agrees and she and Ethan leave to go and observe the competition. Hannah is taken to a match where she watches a fight between Spitfire, and Hannah is horrified to watch this match as she watches her friend, Spitfire, essentially become a mindless alien slave, almost like part of a hive mind. Because Eddie essentially says that Otho is a being who was created when a blue substance which was taken from a meteor was mixed with human DNA in a lab. Otho, as a creature, is the Lord in Black Pokey trapped in a human form. And Hannah is absolutely horrified to watch as her friend is essentially killed in front of her, as she becomes part of the alien hive mind. And Hannah is offered the ability to fight against Otho for a significant amount of money. And Ethan attempts to say no, but Hannah then takes control of his mind and forces Ethan to agree to let her fight Otho for an extremely large sum of money. And while Hannah is doing this, she's visited by Webby, who warns Hannah against fighting her brother and essentially says that gaining access to Hannah's powers will set Otho free and allow him to be at his full power as Pacotho, which basically would result in another situation like the guy who didn't like musicals, where the entire world becomes infected and part of the hive mind. But Hannah isn't having this, and so she takes the mind milk and essentially pushes Webby from her mind, which means Webby isn't able to contact her anymore. Hannah then goes and fights Otho, and while she does attempt to attack him, he keeps using Sophia as a shield, which means Hannah pulls her punches because she doesn't want to hurt her friend. And this essentially results in Hannah pretty much being defeated by Otho and almost being taken as part of the hive mind. While this is happening, Lex is doing stock at Toy Zone when she starts unboxing these blue dolls called Sing-Along Pokey, and suddenly these dolls begin attacking Lex and basically start swarming her until she awakens in this void with Webby. Webby explains to Lex that Hannah's in grave danger and that she needs her help. And Webby assists Lex in essentially teleporting herself to the Roller-Rama where Hannah's fighting Otho. Lex appears and manages to pull a detonator out of the pocket of Charles, the man who owns Otho. And the way that Charles has been controlling Otho for all this time is he has a bomb in the bottom of his skull, which, if detonated, would kill him. So Lex detonates this bomb, which causes Otho to essentially explode and die. And Charles, as you can imagine, probably isn't too happy about the fact that his trillion-dollar champion has been killed. So he then goes to try and recruit both Lex and Hannah to fight for him at the Roller-Rama. And they both say no, but Charles basically corners them. And he's about to, basically force them to become fighters for him, when he's held at gunpoint by Ethan, who forces him to let them go. So the group manage to escape and they return home to their penthouse. Once Hannah's in bed, Lex and Ethan basically argue, where Lex tells Ethan that she understands why he did it, but while Ethan desperately tries to apologise for putting Hannah in danger. And then Lex tells Ethan that they'll speak about it again in the morning and goes to bed. The next morning when Ethan wakes up, he finds a letter from Lex that essentially explains why she and Hannah are leaving Hatchetfield. Hannah explains that the reason they have to leave is because even though they escaped, Charles will not stop looking for them and they won't be able to live in peace. And Ethan doesn't have powers, so they left him so that he was able to have a life that wasn't spent on the run. And so Ethan is left alone. And by the time Ethan's woken up, Lex and Hannah are driving in this beat-up-old van, and as they leave Hatchetfield. And as they leave, Hannah confirms with Lex that she knows Lex saw Webby. And then she says to Lex that she believes something similar to this event is happening everywhere. Because you see, Hannah has the ability to see into every single timeline in the Hatchetfield universe. So during Yellow Jackets, she could see into the Black Friday timeline or the Guy Who Didn't Like Musicals timeline. And so in saying this, Hannah is essentially saying that in some way or form, the event of Lex and Hannah leaving Hatchetfield happens everywhere. And that is the end of Yellow Jackets. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you've enjoyed, like it. Is this what the YouTubers do? Like it, I guess. Yeah, I don't know how long this video is, so if you stuck around, thank you so much. If you've enjoyed this, you should follow me on Twitter, where I post Hatchetfield thoughts every single hour of every single day because I have no life. And yeah, I hope this was helpful. And you should watch Nerdy Prudes Must Die on YouTube on October 13th, or available on digital download now, because Team Star Kid are amazing. I'll put all the links to everything in the description. But yeah, thanks for watching. Bye.